Well, good afternoon and welcome everyone to today's webinar. My name is David Godwin and I'm the director of the Southern Fire Exchange program with the University of Florida. This webinar is a collaborative effort in partnership with Mr. John McGuire, director of the Private Lands Prescribed Fire Initiative with Tall Timbers Research Station. Today we're excited about our presentation by Jim Cox, the Stoddard Bird Lab director at Tall Timbers Research Station. Jim will be giving a presentation on the relationships between growing season prescribed fires and ground nesting birds. And this is certainly a topic that's relevant to the Southeast, and it's something that's been argued about and studied and discussed quite a bit. And so I'm glad that you all have taken the time to join us today. I'm looking forward to Jim's presentation. He is certainly an expert Southeastern ornithologist. And now it's my pleasure to introduce our speaker today. Mr. Jim Cox heads up the Stoddard Bird Lab at the famous Tall Timbers Research Station in Tallahassee. The lab focuses on rare and declining birds associated with ecosystems of the Southeast and the importance of fire and maintaining appropriate habitat. Current projects focus on black rail, red cockaded woodpecker, Bachman's and Henslow's sparrows, and the brown-headed nuthatch. The lab also uses the Wade Tract, a rare old-growth site in South Georgia, to assess the ecology of these species and others in a setting that mirrors historic conditions. So with all that, thank you so much for joining us today. We're glad to have you on the line. And welcome, Jim. Really looking forward to your presentation. We're glad to have you. And just one moment, everybody, as we trade out slides.
Good afternoon, everyone, and thanks for the opportunity to talk about some of my favorite subjects, birds and burning. It's a great day to be indoors here with it raining as it is here in Tallahassee. I just hope that electricity holds out. One of the things that happens here real frequently when we have winds and rain is that we have a limb fall or a tree fall on the electrical line and everything goes kaput. But keep fingers crossed here. We're talking about burning for birds today, and especially with the focus on burning here in the southeastern coastal plain, where we have the wonderful Longleaf forest, one of the richest forest systems we had in North America, that used to cover was dominant over an estimated 60 million acres and covered about 90 million acres in total, and was really one of the most diverse forest systems we had in North America for quite a while. It's great to see the restoration efforts underway for this system, which has been sorely depleted. And of course, as part of this, burning is a very critical part of the management of this system. So I just want to show a few old slides of some of the old habitats. This is out in Escambia County back at the early 1900s, just showing what the system with the tall, majestic trees, grassy understory, and relatively paucity of trees and shrubs in the mid-story, but basically a grassland that has this wonderful, majestic, dominant pine overseeing everything below. Here's actually a shot from in South Central Florida near Wauchula, Florida. Again, you can see the sort of same structure there. Nice, majestic longleaf pine, open mid-story, and then the ground cover below. And finally, we have some examples of this still here in the Red Hills region where I work. This is a picture of the Wade Tract that David just mentioned. In this shot, you can just see some of the wonderful dynamics here. You can see the regeneration that's taking place there, that little patch of young pines coming up, and a gap between the canopy trees. And if you look real closely, you see that it's an unburned patch. You can see the tawny brownish colored grasses there that didn't burn the past time through. And so you can see that a cohort of young pines coming in where that patch was. It didn't burn the last time the area was burned. Of course, the thing to maintain this grassy understory and the system was periodic fire. Basically slow-moving, low-intensity ground fires that came through frequently through the area. They didn't scorch the trees all the time, but basically they just raised the temperature of ground level up to around 800 to 1,000 degrees Fahrenheit, and basically killed off the ground cover vegetation and just kept passing through the system without doing much damage to anything above it. So it came through here, would basically top kill a lot of the plants there, and that's an important thing to remember, is that top killing doesn't mean it's dead, it just means the top of the plant has disappeared. And we know what happens when you remove this. This is one of our famous study sites on tall timbers, known as NB66. Now over 60 years, it hasn't been burned. The top slide shows NB66 back in 1966 when fire was removed, and as the time goes on, how the vegetation changed. The circle shows the same tree in 1966 and 1981, and the system moving from a pine grassland into a very much a hardwood thicket with a totally different structure. Done a lot of bird work on that too, and we had some species that disappear within 3 or 4 years. Bachman sparrows, they were going off the track after about 3 years. Kingbirds, shrikes disappear within 3 years as well too. And at the end of the cycle, we had these other species, those that like hardwoods coming in, things like wood thrush and red-eyed vireo towards the end of this. I think it's really important. People think that you're oftentimes trading out one species for another, but you're actually, in our systems here in the Southeast, the species richness is declining. Our most diverse systems are those open pinelands, and this is a shot of the species richness on NB66 as a function of time, showing that we're down by about 30% the species richness that was present on the site way back in the 1960s. Again, these systems in the Southeast were the dominant sort of landform and supported a tremendous biodiversity. There are a lot of frequency in terms of longleaf restoration and management of frequent fire. The fuels are consumed in a controlled manner. If you have a really long period with field buildup, you can have fires that are scorchers that can actually do damage to the trees. An important thing about having frequent fire is keeping that fire controlled when you do set it. Another thing that fire provides, it kills off some of the low value trees, some pines that might not be desired, as well as some brush that keeps it in check. And these are very important benefits. In terms of longleaf too, it also provides the open ground needed for seedling establishment. Longleaf sprouts when it hits bare ground and takes a few years to get going. And it really needs that bare ground in order for the seeds to hit. And also for the young pines as well, the control of the brown spot needle blight too is a very important function of fire. If you ask what we know about natural fire season and intervals, well, we can thank a lot of old trees that we still have that had these big scars on the side of them, as shown in this slide here. This was about a 200-year-old pine that fell down on the wade track a few years ago, but that scar there provides a wonderful history of some of the fire return intervals in these pinelands. Those fires, when they come through, they leave a small scar there, and the tree reheals. And if you have a 400-year-old tree, you easily have a nice little picture of how fires took place way back when, even before Europeans were really a common element here. Fortunately, Gene Huffman and some others have been able to document this stuff. They found some pines dating back to the 1600s and basically put together the fire return intervals based on these nice historical trees that were out in the landscape. Basically, back before there's a heavy European influence here, the fires were coming through about every 2 to 3 years, and the variation in the fire return interval was pretty low, with 90% or more of all the fires coming in with at least a 5-year return interval. Important thing to note, because there are 2 types of wood, types of rings. There's the winter and the growing season rings. They could actually pinpoint when these fires came through. Most of the burns occurred when the trees were actively growing. We also look at the weather in our area here in the Southeast too, and particularly in Florida. This is not going to be specific to a lot of other areas, but this is how things kind of pan out in Florida. The polygons that go up and down there show the lightning frequency as a function of month. So here we are in July. You can see about an 18 lightning strikes per 10 kilometers. And the little dots show the intervals, periods of days that have not had rain. So as that increases, shows that there's an increasing lack of rain in the system. And we have 2 peaks here in Florida, both in the April-May window and the October-November window, when things really dry out. As that's happening, we have the first few thunderstorms starting to come through. And we like to think a lot of these fires that got cranked up here in Florida probably occurred in this May through July period, when you have the combination of very dry conditions sometimes coupled with the first few thunderstorms that are coming through the area. One of the other indications of this sort of phenology is the response certain plants have. This shows on the wade track, and what you see on the left is a portion of the track that's burned in April 10th, and on the right, the portion of the track that's burned in April 27th. And just that 17-day difference, you can look at the flowering response of the plant, the wiregrass shown there, is very dramatic with just a very subtle shift in the timing in which the fire came through. And this is another thing that sort of gets us thinking that a lot of these fires came through in sort of that April through June to the July period when the lightning strikes were hitting pretty heavily and we had these dry conditions. So we think of this again, the lightning growing season can be March through September and lightning April through June, and then dormant season when the plants aren't really growing, kind of this December to February period. And the growing season provides a broader window, but a lot of this sort of historical data which suggests the lightning season was when a lot of fires came through, and growing seasons being a period when the plants are actively growing is a much longer window there. Another thing to think about here too is what's happening. You know, if you're trying to control hardwoods in this system, which can reach a point where they can suppress fire and have negative effects on the entire system, the energy storage of hardwoods changes over the year. In the winter, most of the carbohydrates are stored underground. As spring comes out, they start to move those carbs up into the leaves and starts to grow. And later in summer, it's a cycle where it comes in and out. If you hit, depending on when you hit the hardwood, it can affect its abilities to draw forth its resources or affect its ability to sequester those resources. And hitting those hardwoods in that kind of late spring, summer, you're really top killing after the plant is already totally leafed out. And it has to, first of all, it has to redraw nutrients from its roots to grow again, but you also don't have a big above ground component to really take the sun and turn it into new energy. So hitting those hardwoods in that sort of late spring and or summer period can really do a damage on take a hard hit on the hardwoods that are out there because of by depleting the resources they're growing up. Kevin Robertson here at Tall Timbers has actually looked at this on Tall Timbers, looking at the function of hardwood growth as a function of winter season burns on a 1 and 2 year return interval, and then growing season burns on a 1 and 2 year return interval. Based on his findings, if you see the D2 dormant season burn there, it's growing off, continuing to accumulate hardwood mass, biomass over time, even though you're burning it and top killing the tree. Whereas if the growing season, the dark lines there show that growing season burns effectively kill the hardwood and prevent it from accumulating more biomass over time. So this is just, again, one of the functions that these growing season or lighting season fires have on plants. Of course, the big topic for today is what about ground nesting birds and the effects that these have on birds who might be nesting at this time. A nest such as this, which is a Bachman sparrow nest, doesn't have much chance when you've got a burn coming through. A lot of the species that are in this system nest at ground level, and that's what we're going to be talking about today, what they are the actual effects of burning during this time of year when a lot of these birds are nesting. This shows the different number of species at the canopy, mid-story, and ground shrub level in our longleaf systems. The basic point here is that there are a lot of birds that are using that shrub ground level. It's about 100 species total use these pine woods throughout the year. So that means a very heavy component of the diversity is linked back to these ground and shrub level conditions when the changes are happening most dramatically as a result of the fire. And this has caused a lot of people to have really concerns about burning during this season when these birds are nesting. Here's an NRCS guide, for example, to longleaf, and talks about the negative effects of prescribed burns include the destruction of nesting sites, and suggests that in most cases this can be avoided by executing the burn when the nests are unoccupied. And we're going to be focusing on that today and the implications that this has for longleaf restoration. We really aren't getting burning on the ground as much as we should through most areas, and anything that inhibits the application of fire could be affecting the overall longleaf system. I'm going to focus today on 5 different species, all of them kind of associated with that ground level, even though the brown-headed nuthatch that you see hanging upside down there on the upper right spends most of its time foraging up in the high canopy. He actually breeds very close to the ground. So we've got 5 different stories about the effects that these growing or lightning season burns are going to have on nesting birds in our longleaf system. I'd like to point out that all 5 of the birds we're talking about today are listed somewhere as a species of conservation concern. Those are the red stars coming out. I also note too, this is a table that shows different rare species and whether or not they're listed by states in Arkansas, Alabama, and throughout the Southeast. And those that are ranked at the top are listed by more states and at the bottom by fewer states. The red indicates what we're talking about today, but also note that there are all these other species with the green stars that are also very much tied to frequently burned systems. So what we're talking about extends much beyond the 5 species that we'll be focused on today. The key one of these is Bachman sparrows. I showed the nest just a second ago. It looks like a pretty drab bird from a distance, but when you get it in the hand, it's very colorful. You can see some of these sort of cinnamon tones there, and the wings have this bright yellow patches you can't see very well there, but getting these birds in their hands, they stop looking like little brown jobs and actually have pretty colorful animals. It's been declining throughout its range and is listed in every state practically as a species conservation concern. We've been working with this bird for over 20 years, but when we first started working on this, the conventional wisdom was that sparrows disperse if you burn during the breeding season and never return. Their survival was reduced and lowered after burning. They didn't see any breeding activity following burns on one site to where this is studied. The post-burn densities were low, and the burns, they felt at the time, may eliminate all breeding opportunities because the adult survival is not very long. It's only around 50%, at least what they estimated back then. And this is one reason we started looking at this jade bird. You think about an animal that has evolved in a system that burned as much as our southeastern pinelands burned, had to develop some means of dealing with these fires or else it wouldn't be on the landscape. So the way we do this is we catch birds, we put color bands on them so we can follow them around. And this shows one of my favorite stories here. This is bird number 1177. And you see the dots where we saw this bird from 2003 through 2007 on this small area on the wade track. There's burned in the 03, 05, and 07. And here's this male just hanging out in that same area, doesn't care. It's been burned through every time. It maintains the same territory. We had a bunch of these birds. We banded up around 360 total with this particular project involved. We got a lot of great information, not on just the where they were using, the areas they were using, but also on survival and nesting success. Unfortunately, our last sighting of this bird occurred in April 07, about 400, 500 meters south of where it's been seen for all the previous 5 years. And there's a story here that we'll get into right now that describes why this bird abandoned its territory in April 07, which occurred just 3 weeks before we were going to burn it. Key thing to think about with this bird are the nest site conditions that it looks for when it's deciding where to place its nest. Now this is a picture of a nest and you think it might be burned up very easily, but actually the birds are using the most recently burned areas as nest sites. We found about 50 nests, and 90% of the nests were in areas that had been burned within the previous 10 months. And a very small percentage, 10%, was found in areas that had burned more than 18 months previously. And this was searching both areas equally thoroughly to find nests. The birds are putting their nest in the most recently burned areas that you've got out there. We decided to sort of measure some of the variables around nest sites and compare these with conditions out on the landscape, particularly looking at what happens to the vegetation 2, 6, 12, and 18 months after burn. How does it accumulate? And what are the conditions that most mimic where the sparrows are putting its nest? Basically, this is following the burn as it works through a cycle from about up to 18 months and comparing these back to the conditions that we found at nest sites. This slide shows a box plot of the percent of bare ground as it declines over time. Basically, once you burn, you have very much an open ground cover conditions, and slowly that begins to get covered in with grasses, fallen needles, and all sorts of other stuff. You can see 2 months after the burn, we had about 8 to 9% ground cover, bare ground still present. Down to around 6 months is down to around 5% on average. 12 months is getting lower than that, and down to around 2 or 3% once you get out to around 18 months. Wonder where the sparrows are putting the nest? It's way back up there where there's a heck of a lot more ground, bare ground present than what you have 12 to even 18 months after burn. So the question is, how many nests do you think you're burning when you burn at a 2-year interval? The answer is not very many at all. Most of the nests that you've got out there are in the most recently burned sites because that has the open ground the birds are looking for in order to make a living. The reason this bird left, we suspect, is because it was in search of greener territories. This was a pretty wily old male at this point, hadn't been able to attract the mate from March and through early April, and just decided the conditions here aren't good for me. He only waited for about 3 weeks after we burned. He would have had great conditions for attracting a mate. One thing to be aware of too is a lot of people look at the singing frequency for this bird as an indication of habitat quality. What this slide shows, again, a box plot for on the right, unpaired birds, those are birds that don't have mates, their singing rates compared to the birds that are paired over a 10-minute period. If you go out into a plot and you find in late April and you find a bunch of singing males, you've got the loser males there that weren't able to attract mates that are singing away. If you go into a site and you only hear a few males singing, you're dealing with a site where the males are successful in attracting the females, and the females again are ones who are picking the sites to nest and build a nest, and so that's just going basically on the number of birds seen is not necessarily the best key to where the good habitat is. So thinking about this information from the Alabama guide sheet about when it's best to burn when you should avoid burning because of Bachman sparrows, this is what it would look like. The earliest nests that we find are around March 20th, and the latest nests are in late September. That's over half of the year in which this bird is nesting and potentially has nests on the ground. One thing to take away from this too is that this bird has a lot of opportunities within that large cycle within which to breed. And if you conduct a burn earlier, it's got a whole lot of time after you finish that bird to come back in and even make use of that nest. So this is a very important consideration. And also, if you factor in Christmas holidays and everything like that, you probably only you can probably whack off another quarter of this circle to where you've got a very narrow range within which you can conduct burns and not affect sparrows. Done a lot of work with northern bobwhite in our game bird program as well too, looking at this bird and its effects, the response it has to growing season burn. Up in the upper left, you can see a 1,000-acre study area that we looked at back in 2006. We basically radio telemetry about 50 quail, and then we've monitored their survival. And you can see into the right, the number of individuals still left as we got into July and August and September, and you can see the steep decline there. If you look in the upper left, you also see a lot of March, April burns where the months are mentioned, where the areas burned. The green areas weren't burned in that particular year, but you can just see just a lot of March and April burning and collapse into a very narrow window. Second slide shows that same thing in the survival of the birds back in 2007. If you notice there, you'll see also some June burns mixed in. So you have March, June, and a lot of June burns mixed in with those March and April burns. And what this basically allowed it to do was by the time you burned in June, a lot of those areas in March had already covered to the point that they were suitable for quail. And you can see the corresponding survivorship of quail of individuals there on the right-hand side being much higher through 2007. So we still had about 70% of the tagged birds present way out through mid-June, whereas in the 2006, that was already down to around 40% of the birds that were present. Basically, in particular for the hens, the survival improved by 67% in 2007 by extending those burns into June and not having the entire area blackened out completely as a result of the burning. The other thing to consider too is the relative importance of nesting success versus adult survival. If you are having some reduction in nesting success by your burning, you can easily offset that by improved adult survival. You can think about which may lay as many as 12 to 15 eggs in a year. Only one or two or three of those are going to actually make it to the nesting or to the fledgling stage. And having that adult survival increase by improved habitat conditions is going to easily offset any reduction in nesting that might occur as a result of burning a nest up. Another colorful sparrow that we've worked on a lot here is the Henslow sparrow. And unlike the previous two birds, this bird doesn't nest in our area, but it's a migratory species that comes in from up north. And like with a lot of other sparrows, spends its winter here in the southeastern coastal plain. This was at one point the most rapidly declining songbird we had in North America and was a great concern. Things have improved thanks in large part to some of the CRP programs that have been happening up during in its breeding range. We do some winter sampling for this bird, basically some flush counts, and the take-home message of this particular slide is just the much higher abundance we have on these counts in winter. The bright red showing where we flush 5 to 0.7 sparrows per each flush run that we make, and the yellow being a much lower number of birds. So again, the burns shown in the gray area in 2005, and then the burns shown in 2006 is gray, just flipping on the other side of the weight track, showing the higher abundance of this particular winter sparrow that we have in these areas following those burns that took place. So you're also providing very good wintering habitat for species when you burn, regardless of the season. And again, what's going on here for a lot of these sparrows is they really like to have these open conditions at ground level. Here where we work, 18 months, showing a picture on the right, the wiregrass has already started to senesce, the needles have started to fall back onto the ground. It's really clogged up. On the left, it shows about 6 months. You can see the way those taut grass blades are still high and erect, and there's a lot of space in between for the birds to run. Now we have very rich soils here, so these exact dates could be longer in areas where you have very sandy soils that aren't quite as productive as ours. But again, the point being that these sparrows are using these areas when there's very open conditions at ground level roughly from about 3 to 12 to maybe 14 months after the most recent burn. The other thing too is important is that you've got this wonderful flush of seeding that takes place after a burn, particularly some of the late season April burns where we get a wiregrass flowering as well, and there's things such as this lopsided Indian grass. These provide very important habitat for these wintering sparrows that visit our areas. Another bird that perhaps is not as well known as a longleaf specialist, because it's not, quite frankly, is the common nighthawk. This is also known as the bullbat locally, and it's getting to that time of year where we can start to see much of nighthawks moving through the area, especially if you attend football games, and you'll see them cruising around trying to get the malls and stuff that are attracting to the lights. I'd like to point out this bird spends its summers up here, but goes way down into Argentina and to southern South America to spend its winter. So it puts on about 4,000 to 5,000 miles of traveling time in between using our areas here and its winter haunts. But they regularly nest in pine woods starting about 1 week after burn. They nest on the ground. They like it totally open. They don't like any vegetation whatsoever. But regularly after burn, you can have 5 or 6 nighthawks that will move into a recently burned area, lay their 2 eggs, and try to make a go of it. They'll fledge within about 12 to 15 days, and then you can see them hung around with their young for another few weeks there before they're able to fly and carry off. So for this particular bird, the suitable conditions disappear within a couple of months after your most recent burn. I point that out just because with all the birds out there, this graph shows sort of like a habitat suitability index for these 3 birds. The nighthawks disappearing very, very quickly after a burn. Bachman sparrow rising, it takes a little while for it to reach its peak, like 6 to 8 months after burn, and for quail a little bit longer. But then they also decline as the time since burn continues to lengthen. So when you're up burning here at 24, 2 to every 3 years, you're actually moving this entire graph back towards the left, improving habitat conditions for a lot of these birds that nest and use the ground level in these sites. Another consideration is that we mentioned these species that renest a lot. Quail and Bachman sparrows are renesting maybe even 4 or 5 times. In particular, Bachman sparrows, I know for 4 nests is about the maximum they'll try to pull off. But some species that nest in our pine woods nest early and only once each year. And that's where the brown-headed nuthatch comes in. This is a small songbird. It looks like a big head with basically the feathering and musculature needed to carry that head through the canopy feeding. But it nests very low in our area, sometimes only 2 or 3 feet off the ground. And I've included it here as another bird that can be affected pretty dramatically by fires. This bird nests in February through May, with most of the nests underway by very early March in our area. So if you're burning in late February, March, you have a chance of burning up one of these snags, decaying small snags, and it happens all the time with the nuthatch that we work on, is that their nest to be burned up. They may try to renest after this point, depending on the time of the year, but they may not. But if they do decide to nest, it's also oftentimes leads to very low nest survivorship, because the snakes start arising sometime in late March and April, and we regularly find a much higher mortality of the females that are in there incubating their eggs later in the year. They're basically sucked up by the rat snakes that climb up there and make easy picking off of them. So what I've done here in the black extended that previous slide showing when it would be inappropriate to burn when birds are nesting. You basically take the period of the Bachman sparrow and you knock it back another 45 days to, again, to avoid burning when there are nesting birds out there. You increasingly narrow the window within which you can conduct a burn. Another key point I think it is what actually happens following one of these growing or lightning season burns in an area. How quickly does it return, and what's the information we have on how quickly these birds are able to recover? We did one study on the Wade track where we had on the left there is a 25-acre study area that we censused 4 times prior to the burn, and then we conducted 9 more surveys right after the burn, visiting about once every 5 to 7 days. This was a 25-acre block immersed within a 170-acre burn block that we burned in very late May on the 28th of May in 2003. Here's what quail did. Within a week or 2 after the burn, there were numbers in that area much higher than they were during the pre-burn area, up by 3 times as much after the 6-week period, just again showing that you're creating habitat for a lot of these ground nesting, ground dwelling birds. The other thing we found happened real quickly too, a lot of birds just simply started renesting right after the fire finished. We had a northern cardinal, first nest in June 13th, probably about 15, 16 days after the nest, after the burn, had fledged young. 24th, a blue grosbeak, another shrub dwelling bird, had young in the nest. Bachman sparrows were back there breeding by July 1st. Towhees and northern bobwhite, all these other birds that nest on the ground were back in there just a few weeks after the burn. And overall, the ground nested species decreased in the first 3 weeks after the burn, but then increased above their pre-burn abundances after that 3-week period lapsed. One of the important things to remember here too is that after you burn, a lot of these predators that are out there doing a lot of damage to these ground nesting birds also become very scarce. Things like raccoon decrease in abundance. And it may actually be those first few months after burn are one of the best times that you can possibly have to try to bring off the young in a setting such as this. Now, context matters. Importantly, with all of this stuff, you can't get away with the sort of variation that we have. If you're a 200-acre site surrounded by center pivot agriculture, you might not even have any of these species on such a small site. But even on something such as this 22-acre site, 2,200-acre site, there'd be an opportunity to mix and match the burns, burning a little bit earlier, burning a little bit later in the year. And so mixing it up so that you can maintain a range of different states of a site being burned. But again, in some places, if you're trying to restore longleaf and you're a 50-acre holding somewhere in the middle of nowhere practically, you don't have to worry about all these ground nesting birds at all when you're burning, and you can burn with just as convenient as it is for you. And there are real practical reasons, again, for considering growing season or these lightning season burns. Are they more effective in controlling hardwoods, creates good condition for longleaf seedling establishment, and the negative effects on birds are minor and very short term. The real big reason for considering this is it expands the window of opportunity for burning, and this is extremely important. So here's just on some of the public lands that we deal with in Florida. All of them have a backlog, a burn deficit, if you will, that sometimes is up to 20 to 25% of the total area. Some of these are extremely large. The Apalachicola National Forest south of town hasn't met its burn goal over most of the area for the upland pines that they manage for a large portion of it. These burn deficits are only going to grow larger if we continue to try to stop applying burns during the time of year we have these nesting birds out there, excuse me. The other thing I'd like to mention too is that it goes much beyond birds as well. A lot of other species very much benefit from these type of burns that come through during this period of the year when things are drying out, the growing season. Flatwood salamanders, for example, they use these ephemeral ponds that are immersed within our flatwoods, and flatwoods that go long burned only during the winter months tend to accumulate these thickets of tie that are just totally not what the salamander needs. And this salamander particularly has undergone a lot of losses as a result of the fact of winter burning almost exclusively in areas, not creating conditions where those ties are being wiped out during the dry period by a very decent fire coming through there and controlling them better. It's always best to remember that lack of fire is a disturbance in the system, and the less we use fire, actually the more disturbed it becomes. It's the way to think about it. So that I'll kind of close up and we'll switch over to questions just with a few kind of closing thoughts. Growing season fires don't threaten ground nesting birds when used to maintain frequent burn intervals over large areas. Fire improves habitat suitability, food resources, and essential nutrients for these declining ground nesting birds. And the short-term negatives are offset by habitat improvement and much longer-term gains that are very beneficial. And a lot of this information is summed up in a little pamphlet we put together several years ago called Lightning Season Burning, Friend or Foe of Breeding Birds. It's available on our website for you to download. And if you want to scan the QR code there to the left, it'll take you there directly. And I'll leave it there and look forward to any questions there might be about ground nesting birds and lightning season burning.
All right, thank you so much, Jim. That was a great presentation. Once again, if you joined us during the presentation, my name is David Godwin, and I'm the director of the Southern Fire Exchange with the University of Florida. We just had a presentation by Jim Cox, Stoddard Bird Lab Director at Tall Timbers Research Station in Tallahassee. At this point in our program, we'd like to provide an opportunity for you to ask questions, to submit them to Jim. So please type your questions and comments into the Q&A tool in Zoom. You'll see that on your screen labeled Q&A, and that will allow us to get through as many questions as we can. It also allows you to vote for other questions that you see submitted so that we can try and get to the most number of questions in the time we have remaining. So Jim, I'm going to hop right over here to the Q&A. Here's a question that came in and from Peter, and Peter asked, my question is, how does the way the fires are set impact ground nesting birds? So could you talk about ignition methods or patterns?
Sure, sure. I usually rank things out as we have season as being the most important, or excuse me, frequency as being most important, and ignition patterns tend to be pretty far down there right now compared to other things such as season afterwards. There are some issues. Most people aren't doing ring fires anymore. That can have an effect on some of the birds, of course, by entrapment. But there's the other types of ignition that might occur with mostly with flank fires and putting in lines of flame. Generally, that provides the bird with enough time to get out of the way of fire, except for the real small birds too. The fledglings, of course, and the nests could be affected by that. But the actual way that fires are ignited and most of our pine woods aren't a big issue. I do worry a little bit about ignition patterns in some marshes, some of the burns there where they have maybe encircling our birds pretty noticeably with the way that they're doing ignition, but most of our pine woods, this doesn't seem to, the ignition it's a very low effect compared to some of the other things, such as frequency and the season of which the fires are applied.
Here's a question that came in from Paul, and Paul asked if you've noticed an effect of the size of prescribed burn units on quail habitat.
On quail habitat or quail populations, just on quail habitat, the only things I've noticed is sometimes the edge effects that you see are a little more pronounced sometimes. But in quail numbers, these bird scales along the line of 20 to 50 acres as conducted here, tall timbers are what they sort of shoot for helping with keeping the quail, the balance between burning and burning at a scale that makes it suitable for the quail not to be displaced too much.
Here's a question that came in, and could you talk about, is there a decrease in nesting? Let's see, does the decrease in nesting birds also decrease the diversity of others? The question is the fire the only reason, or are some other anthropogenic disturbances also at play there?
Well, the slide that I showed was specific to natural pine stands where fire was the only tool being applied to them. If you get into a mix of residential and other things, we know that simply because you can't apply fire as much when you have in certain landscapes, that the things that humans that are doing around our natural areas are going to have some effect on some of those species. But really, I was addressing specifically within natural forest what the effects would be, and where anthropogenic changes are pretty small and not very meaningful.
Here's a question for Mary. Could you talk about snag density in pine flatwoods specifically for cavity nesters? Do you have any recommendations for the optimum snag density?
It's much higher than what's in the published literature. I can tell you that. We just completed some work on some cavity nesting birds. And, in old growth settings, there are two things going on. In old growth settings, you have conditions where you've got red-cockaded woodpeckers that are excavating these living cavities, and those cavities are very long-lived. The younger the forest, the less likely the red-cockaded woodpeckers are going to be able to provide the cavities that a lot of these species would use in addition to red-cockaded. But I would be shooting for somewhere around at least four snags per acre as a good sort of round number there, knowing full well that in some of the areas where you have red-cockadeds, it could be up to around 6 to 10 red-cockaded plus natural snags out there on the landscape.
Here's a question that came in from Kim, and Kim is asking about fire in marshes, and is specifically, Kim asks, is sending a head fire through marshes bad for for nesting birds. Could you talk about different ignition methods specific to marsh habitat?
I was thinking more of the marsh, the ignition patterns I've seen there were like helicopters are used, and you've got a lot of where there's a lot of flame wings that are convening on a central location. It can be effective. We know, for example, that burning at some times of the year for black rails can have an effect, and burning at other doesn't have quite as much of an effect. As far as um, sending a head fire through a marsh, if it's when they're nesting, it's going to have a big effect on the nestlings in the nest. But for a lot of the birds, the other birds there, they can probably get ahead of it unless it's a very rapidly advancing fire.
Could you talk?
We really don't know a lot about marshland burning as much as we should. That's a big area of warrants additional research here, particularly throughout the Gulf Coast.
So could you talk a little bit about your black rail project?
Oh, sure, sure. We have a project actually looking at the effects of fire on a lot of these marshland species now. Right now, we're really interested in just trying to get narrow in the frequency of when these areas might have burned, and what, say, a modest frequency around every 2 years versus a longer frequency of 4 years may have had. Because you have the same things happening, is that there is a lot of accumulation of vegetation at ground level. A lot of the rails and stuff are making a living, and we were trying to figure out how much it impedes some of these species from making it in some of these areas.
We have a question that came in from Mary, and Mary's asking about the effective burn block size. Could you talk about that?
It's sort of similar to the quail question earlier about burn block size. My personal ranking of things is that frequency is the most important thing you have, and whatever you can do, if you have your frequency maintained, then yes, you can start thinking about changing some other things such as the burn block, or maybe limiting the fires to certain seasons. But until you've got that frequency, which we don't have on a lot of sites, these other things are less concern, or they're not as important of an issue for a lot of these birds. Now, if you got that frequency handled, then yes, there are issues about that you can start tweaking with the extent of burns that may be helpful. Um, we regularly burn at 300 to 400 acre blocks here and see pretty good quail numbers, see great Bachman sparrows. We could see improved quail numbers if the block size was probably around 50 acres. But then again, you have the size of the block that you're treating not quite as being as efficient, perhaps if you treated a larger block, and some other issues like that. So it depends on balancing, and it depends on what your main focus is for this, or what your primary focuses are for a site. The high burn block, again, is a very important consideration if you have your frequency at this point where it's coming through at least every 3 or more years or more frequently.
We have a question that came in from Chelsea, and Chelsea is given an example of a site that's seen uh, quite a few dormant season fires, and Chelsea
Mhm.
wants to know, how many seasons of dormant season fires do you think are leading to a degradation in the habitat for ground nesting birds?
It's going to vary, unfortunately. But we do see, for example, we have some fire plots on tall timbers that have been burned annually, every other year, and every 3 years primarily during the dormant season. We see that once you get the 1 to 2 years tend to have very good conditions. Once you get beyond 3, then you start to see less of the conditions aren't as good. But those conditions on the 3 start to only appear like 8 to 20 years after the plots were being burned. So it can take a couple of decades, but it also depends on how dramatic a response you're looking for. And even there are subtle differences in the 1 and 2 year fire plots here too, that even 2 year return intervals carried out over a 60-year period will have an effect. So that you've got to just sort of keep track of that and ratchet up the burning as needed to kind of counteract the effects that those long-term conditions have.
Here's a question that came in from Steve, and Steve asks more specifically about flatwoods ecosystems. Could you talk about uh, your presentation today and thinking in terms of lightning season fires and flatwood sites?
Oh, I'd love to be able to answer that one. That's for me, a very key question. I mean, we know that the lightning season period is very important for nailing some of the vegetation characteristics in flatwoods. We know we can't do it every year. So I'm wondering what mix of transition season burning or growing season burning you need to maintain those suitable conditions in flatwoods, while also recognizing that you may need to have some burns taking place outside of that narrow window in order to maintain frequency. So I would love to see some long-term studies on, say, the relationship of two transition season fires versus two winter fires that are being introduced into a flatwood setting every 3 years to see what the effect has there, just to get a better handle on that. I think with the flatwoods, it's the areas I know that are really extremely in great shape have a very high frequency of those transition season fires that they're using to maintain those conditions.
We have a question that came in from Paul, and Paul's asking, you mentioned predators in your presentation, and Paul said, did you say that predators are less prevalent in areas managed for quail after a burn?
Certain predators, yeah, certain predators are. There's a drop in things like raccoons and some of the other meso mammals and stuff. Raptors, they come in really soon after burn, but once the vegetation recovers a little bit, then they are not as prevalent. Things like kestrels will move in, and as long as the bare ground conditions are prevalent. A lot of the other things, Cooper's hawks and stuff, aren't really as, they're focused maybe on that very first couple of weeks when there's bare ground conditions, and then they're not as prevalent, or they're equally as prevalent there as they are in some of the other areas where they occur. So the main thing I think are these meso mammals that take nest, and the other predators are pretty much at sort of like baseline conditions of raptors and stuff over the entire period.
We have a question that came in from John, and John is asking about turkeys. So could you, we didn't talk about turkeys as much today, but could you talk about lightning season burns and turkey impacts on turkey nesting populations?
Yeah, we look at that, and there was the suggestion again there is a little bit like quail in that the turkeys use the frequently burnt areas very heavily. And yes, you can burn up turkey nests. They can extend into a long unburned area a little bit more than the quail have. But again, they're using those recently burned areas so frequently that the best we can tell that there is a very big benefit of continuing to burn during the growing season for turkeys as well too, just because of the suitable conditions it creates for the birds later on in fall and in winter.
And I'll add that we hosted a webinar last year with Dr. Mike Chamberlain from the University of Georgia, all about turkeys and fire, and he covered issues of season of burn and scale of burn, and quite a bit of in-depth research on turkeys and prescribed fire. So you can find the recording of that presentation on our Southern Fire Exchange YouTube channel, and we have a fact sheet that's currently in the works that will be out later this year, talking just about fire and turkeys in the Southeast. So we have some more questions that came in here. Laura asked, do you have recommendations on timing to conduct mechanical treatments? Because as Laura mentions, many places they're working in areas where it's really a challenge to get the fire return intervals that they're wanting to get to. So they use mechanical treatments. And can you talk about how to put that tool into context while also thinking about ground nesting birds?
Sure. Well, most of the ground nesting birds, if you're having to use mechanical treatments, there aren't going to be a lot of ground nesting birds in that setting. Things like Bachman sparrows would not be using it, and a lot of the other ones. As far as the mulch and everything that's left over afterwards, it's the best recommendation is to get that burned off as quickly as you can, and then start applying the fire after that. Basically mulch and then burn. But in terms of actually doing damage to the birds, generally they've already left the area. We've reached a point where there's going to be a lot of mulching. There could be some cardinals or something in there, but the sparrows and the other species we were talking about here today have probably already moved on at that point.
Here's a question from Steve. And Steve is asking about kind of from a communications perspective and thinking about How do you think we can get more folks to change their perspectives on dormant season and growing season fires and really increase the acceptance and application of fires during the growing season or lightning season?
Well, stuff like this, the presentations help out. And again, that pamphlet that we developed was our best, broad outreach tool that we had, and it covers it pretty well. It includes turkeys and about 5 or 6 other species. Um, Sometimes it's old habits die hard, but really, my base recommendation just keep sticking with the phrase the species of conservation concern are using the area you burned last year, not the area that you're planning to burn this year if you've got a 2 or 3 year old rough in it. They're always in the most freshly burned stuff you've got, and the numbers in those 2 and 3 year old roughs are much diminished over what you have, and you can eat them in a recently burned area.
So this is circling back, I think, to something you've covered a little bit, but just to clarify, we had a question that came in from James. James is asking about rotating dormant season and growing season burns every other burn cycle. Um, or or are you advocating only to use growing season burns?
I advocate frequency. If you can maintain your frequency with transition season fires, that's great. If you're not, then you've got to think of other ways to put fire on the landscape. Frequency is the number one thing. It makes it easier to burn. And when you have high frequencies, and the frequency is always at the top of my list. And the reason I talk about growing season and light season fires is to help, I hope, improve the acreage that's being treated with fire each year. Not that that's the only way that you should do it or necessarily something that everyone should be striving to do. But again, we need to increase the frequency and we shouldn't eliminate opportunities just because we think we might burn up a one nest or two.
Here's a question also, this is from James, and James is asking mid to late, this is rather location specific, mid to late growing season get exceptionally hot and dry with risk to some coastal, I think that means South Carolina loblolly sites.
Mhm.
Um, James then says so then they're thinking that March, April is best. So in response to that question, could you also maybe provide some guidance or thoughts on outside of Florida, how do people define or figure out where um, that that lightning season fire is likely to have occurred in their region if they're not in Florida?
Um, Plant responses would be one opportunity or one idea there, but I think that you need to look at sort of your weather patterns and possibly, I think it shifts the window a little bit. I don't think it changes it super dramatically. So you may shift it like 3 to 6 weeks in one direction or the other. But there tend to be these bimodal peaks with those dry periods in the southeastern landscape. And that's what I would look at more as sort of a guide for when these may have happened, but then also things like plant responses too. The wiregrass here, when we burn, it can be a 2 or 3 week difference in when the burn comes through, and you see a dramatically different flowering response on those plants. So there's a couple things, tools you might use there. There is some dendrochronology work for some areas. I think like in oh, I'm drawing a blank. There's some guy worked on it, I believe, up in even Arkansas that may serve as a guide there too. But if there's not dendrochronology stuff, I would use the existing weather patterns that you have as a way to sort of figure out when these natural fires may have occurred.
We have a question that came in from John asking about growing season burns in oak woodlands. Do you have any resources or places that he could turn to for additional information?
I unfortunately have not worked in oak woodlands at all with burning. There has been a little bit of work I know from people at the University of Tennessee on some of these issues. I unfortunately, and in Missouri as well too, but I have not spent much time and just had some vague recollections and prefer that you go to the source rather than have me try to draw it from a.
I see that Johnny Stowe added a comment in the chat window regarding Mike Stambaugh's lab at Mizzou.
Okay, yeah, Mike
Uh,
Campbell.
and yep, they have a great tree ring laboratory there. They've done fire history work in oak woodlands from Missouri down to Texas and even work over in Pennsylvania. And there, Mike and Joe Marshall are the lead folks for the Oak Woodlands Forest Fire Consortium there, and there are our neighbor fire science exchange. So if you go to firescience.gov, you can find the map for the other fire science exchange networks and reach those guys. And they are really the go-to experts if you have questions about oak woodlands and fire that I would turn to. So Jim, at this point, I'm going to switch over. If you guys have any other questions that we didn't get to today, the next slide will have Jim's contact information, and you can reach out to Jim and via email, and you guys can ask questions. But in the interest of time, we're gonna move on here. There you go. So it does look like we've run up to about to our time allotment today. There's Jim's email address on the screen if you have additional questions. I know we had some questions about some specific resources that you've developed, Jim, that folks are interested in contacting you to get your information on. So his email address is there on the screen. Jim, thank you so much for your joining us today. Thanks for your great presentation and taking all the time to get through those questions. Thanks everybody for the questions. And thank you, John, for your partnership in making this webinar happen today. So thanks everybody for joining us. We hope that this webinar will be useful in your fire management programs, and have a wonderful afternoon.